Item number 17, Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji.
Speaker, I do want to thank very much the Honourable Minister and congratulate him for rolling out the long overdue National Education Policy 2020, 34 years after its predecessor in 1986. Naturally, sir, in that time, a lot has changed amongst the key domestic and global trends in the education field. Our lack of an updated educational policy framework that took those developments into account had been an obstacle in our goal, a goal shared by all the parties here, of developing a world-class yet affordable education system for all Indians. And I must say that I want to thank particularly Dr. Pokhriyal, because having been in that ministry before his time, I've had the pleasure of meeting him, discussing in great detail at his own welcome the ideas and issues that we both share on moving forward with education. And I was very pleased that, sir, that the Minister responded very constructively, listened to these suggestions, and has included many of them in his policy document. As I've said before, and I will say again, my only regret is that this was not discussed sufficiently inside the Parliament. But I say this to say that the development of our education infrastructure is and must remain a major priority for our country, a bipartisan priority for all parties, really. And I'm confident that even if we have disagreements on specific details, my experiences with our current minister have illustrated that we can certainly constructively engage with each other in the common endeavour of developing a world-class education ecosystem for our country. Now, in that spirit of constructive deliberation, I'd like to share a few concerns that I have, Mr. Chairman, with the allocations in the Union budget for the Ministry of Education, which I'm sorry to say threatens or seems to threaten to stifle the rollout of a truly ambitious national education policy. At a time when the ministry is seeking to roll out a serious and broad policy framework that would be the cornerstone of a sweeping change in our education system, it's indispensable that there be adequate budgetary allocations to facilitate the smooth implementation of the policy. Minister Saab, you will remember that we met soon after you had announced the policy, and I had said, I only hope you will get the funding for this from the Finance Ministry. You assured me it had all been cleared in the Cabinet, but the reality today, unfortunately, is that the budget has been characterized by a rather bizarre series of cuts to the overall budget of the Ministry of Education. Instead of allocations commensurate with the soaring ambitions of the national education policy, we have a shocking but evident disconnect between the targets outlined in the NEP and the financial support being offered by the Honourable Finance Minister. Any hope for positive developments in our primary and higher education ecosystem has been effectively handicapped by the budget allocations, which rather than working towards raising the budget for education to 6% of GDP, has actually slashed the overall financial support to the ministry by the same 6%. As a result, instead of a dedicated effort to prioritize the needs of those young people who will go on to be the future of our country, the allocations of the ministry only constitute 2.67% of the government's estimated expenditure for the financial year and only 3.2% of our nation's GDP. The bulk of the cuts to the ministry have been borne by the Department of School Education, whose budget has fallen from 59,845 crores to 54,873 crores, a 5,000 crore rupee cut at a time when a number of reports have highlighted the crisis of students dropping out of the school system after being unable to make the switch to online classes, the challenges of recovering the academic calendar from the time lost during the pandemic, the necessities of equipping our teachers to handle the digital classroom. This is a time we need more money for school education, not less. Despite the NEP framework rightly recognizing the invaluable contributions of the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan in developing an equitable primary education ecosystem and affording access to the most vulnerable of Indian students, what we are seeing, sir, is sadly that the allocations have betrayed these expectations. Not only has the funding for the National Education Mission fallen by 2% annually since 2019, but the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, which includes the old Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, the Rashtriya Madhyamika Shiksha Abhiyan, and the crucial teacher education heading, has faced the largest set of cuts in this year's allocations. The merger of three schemes into one was done with the aim of developing a more holistic approach to school education, but severely cutting the funding is the clearest message this government can send about the approach it wishes to take. Now, the finance minister announced 100 new Sainik schools in partnership with NGOs, private schools, states, and so on. On paper, welcome development. But a recent document issued by the Navodaya Vidyalaya Samiti that has since been withdrawn suggests this may simply be an excuse to rebaptize some existing Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalayas as Sainik schools. To make matters worse, there is neither any information about funding for these schools in the budget, nor did the Honourable Finance Minister take cognizance of the severe financial distress being faced by the existing Sainik schools. There are multiple Sainik schools in the country that are already not receiving adequate funding from the Ministry of Defence, including one in Karakutum in my constituency, which has produced many a general. These are on the verge of closure. These Sainik schools are producing army cadets and officers that the entire country should be proud of, and yet they've been left with poor infrastructure, rotting away in some instances. The burden on the parents to meet the costs of these Sainik schools is increasing unsustainably. You will forgive me, Mr. Chairman, if I challenge the government to fulfill this announcement by providing adequate funding to rescue the existing Sainik schools that are in distress, and then to establish even just 10 new Sainik schools, not the 100 you have promised, without renaming any of the Navodaya Vidyalayas which are doing their own work properly. We have to face the reality, Mr. Chairman. For the Finance Ministry, the numbers suggest that education is not a priority for this government, nor are systematic cuts to the Ministry of Education a new story. Just last year, the Standing Committee on Human Resource Development had highlighted that the allocations for the Department of School Education was 28% less than what the minister had asked for. 28% they didn't give him. Similarly, the committee had noted that the Samagra Shiksha scheme had not been backed by the funding that the ministry had outlined. But rather than address this deficiency in funding, the government has once again slashed allocation this year by 7,000 crores compared to the same figures for the budget estimate 2020. Now, these cuts, Mr. Minister, are of serious concern to us, since it puts the fate of the laudable targets that you have announced for the NEP in jeopardy. The aspirational quality of the minister's document will mean little if its aspirations are not matched with funding for implementation. Already there are targets that many of us have pointed out may not be realistic. But with these budget allocations, they definitely look beyond possibility, let alone plausibility. For instance, the NEP sets out a target of achieving a gross enrollment ratio, GER, of 50% in higher education by 2035, 14 years from now. Now, we must question how realistic this is, given that the current GER is 26.3% in 2018-19. And in fact, given that if you look back the previous 8 years, when in 2010-11, when we were in government, the ratio was at 19.4%, so it has increased only 6% in 8 years. How are you going to double it in the next 14 years? I don't understand. In fact, the GER for male Indians has actually stagnated in 2018-19. The UGC had set a target of 30% by 2020-21. Mantri Saab can tell us, have we come anywhere close to it? No. And the fact is, it's unlikely to be met in the immediate future. To double the current GER by 2035 in the face of such cuts seems to me to be a completely unattainable dream. Similarly, the Prime Minister eloquently argued that under the new policy, a child can pursue music and mathematics all together at the same time. Very good. Will the government also help both the teachers and the parents to understand who will bear the extra financial burden that these wonderfully expensive pursuits will bring with them? Will every school be equipped with the necessary music equipment, music teachers, faculty, arrangements, primary setup? If so, where is the money for all this in the present budget? भाषण में तो एक चीज कह सकते हैं, लेकिन पैसे कहाँ हैं, यही मेरा प्रश्न है. Mr. Chairman, enrollment is only half the battle. equally important is the challenge of student retention, a challenge that this budget has made only more difficult for the ministry. Key schemes like the national program of midday meals in schools, which despite the closure of schools spent much more money than was budgeted during the pandemic year, are now, when schools are reopening, actually facing budget cuts. This year, when we expect that children will be returning to schools and midday meals are an important part of their day at school again, the budgeted amount is less than what was spent last year, 11,500 crores as compared to RE of 12,900 crores for last year. Sorry. Surely, to get some children to return to schools and stay there and ensure that they're not lost from our education system altogether, these systems require bigger allocations. Similarly, scholarships, that are often the only means for economically disadvantaged students to attend classes, have been affected as well. No wonder that the glaring lack of inclusivity that has been exposed by the pandemic with respect to education and access to education will only get accentuated with the reduction in allocations to scholarship schemes of the government. The National Means Cum Merit Scholarship Scheme, designed for deserving students who do not have the financial means to complete their education, which is a fundamental principle of the minister's NEP, has seen a reduction of 3% in its allocation. The National Scheme for Incentive to Girl Child for secondary education. This is a very important scheme. It's seen its budget slashed from 110 crores last year to 1 crore this year. Now, this is a scheme that focuses on young girls hailing from SC/ST communities, individuals hailing from families that are most vulnerable to dropping out of secondary school, and in a year in which many girl children will have had to take up domestic chores because they're stuck at home thanks to the pandemic lockdown, or activities away from their education, the government in its wisdom has decided to almost completely eliminate the budget for this national incentive scheme for girl children. I think the minister will have to explain to his finance minister what the problem is with this kind of approach. Now, these vulnerable communities have also in many cases been the primary victims of the serious digital divide that has been exposed by the pandemic. As classes shifted online, not only were our teachers, overworked and underpaid as they are, ill-equipped to handle such a significant change, but our experience only demonstrated that online learning in its current form is exclusionary and discriminatory. It should be a matter of great shame for all of us that even in my own state of Kerala, which is supposed to be an educational beacon for the country, we had incidents like that of the death of a school topper, a class 10 student who hailed from a Dalit family in dire economic conditions, because when classes shifted online, father was a daily wage earner, he had no wages coming in during the pandemic and the lockdown, so they were unable to give her a smartphone to follow online classes. The state government, having realized this, started showing some of the online classes on television, but the family didn't have a television. The one that was available to them was broken. They couldn't afford to repair it. And you know what? This girl, in grief at missing her classes and not being able to keep up with her better-off classmates, took her own life, a class topper. Similarly, many of you have read in the newspapers about the mathematics student at LSR College in this city, in Delhi, who was academically brilliant, a recipient of a government scholarship, but chose to take her life apparently on the grounds that she did not have the resources to buy a laptop. Her scholarship payments were delayed by the government, and she felt that she did not want to be a financial burden to the family. These are crucial issues, Mantri Sahab, and I'm sure that the finance ministry ought to be listening to these very, very important concerns. So, Mr. Chairman, when I tell these stories, these two young women were not just bright sparks in their own right, but in many ways they represent the future of our country, a future that in their cases was destroyed by our inability to provide sufficient safeguards against the disturbances caused by online classes. We need to, both in the national education policy and in any other schemes the government rolls out, do better to rise to the challenge of this digital divide. A recent survey of 10,000 students across 400 cities found that only 17% had access to laptops. Only 4% had access to smart tablets. Another reputable report has highlighted stark infrastructural challenges within government schools. Only 28% of government schools have computers. Only 12% even have an internet connection. Last mile connectivity is practically non-existent in many of our rural schools. Now, the shortcomings of our online education, and especially the struggles of those who have not been able to gain proper access to it, have been put into sharp focus during this ongoing pandemic. The reputable organization Oxfam did a study across 5 Indian states, surveying over 1,000 parents and nearly 500 teachers. And it shows that over 80% of the respondents felt that digital schooling had failed during the lockdown. Now, I'm not arguing this is a uniquely Indian problem. The UN has pointed out that some estimated 24 million school-going children are likely to drop out on account of this problem worldwide. But we have to address this challenge. We're now supposed to be reforming and reviving education. And I must say, the very definition of education in India must include digital literacy now, if our children are to gain essential access to contemporary sources of knowledge. There is a need to digitalize classrooms through the introduction of a national computer curriculum in all languages that allows children in primary schools to achieve a basic understanding of how to operate a computer. I mean, what was pen and paper to our generation is now a keyboard and a mouse. And the fact is that children have to learn that if they have to survive in today's world. This would require the government to allocate the necessary funds to ensure that computers are available and that teachers are trained. With the existing barriers and dividers of class, caste, gender, it's likely that the current push towards online education will actually divide our society more, Mr. Minister, unless we can find money for them. We want to make it a tool for progress, we have to find funding. It was really disappointing to note that there was no mention in the Honourable Finance Minister's speech of any attempt to address the challenges of online education and digital divide, no provisions to compensate for education lost during the pandemic, not even a roadmap for those who have been separated from the fold because of these barriers within our system. I'm really hoping that my friend, the Honourable Minister for Education, will address these when he replies to us today. And I do want to say it's not just our young students who are disadvantaged. The burden of transitioning from a physical classroom to a virtual space has been equally shared by our teachers as well. We certainly welcome the increased allocations under the head of teacher training. But even there, this is only 250 crores or 0.5% of the total budget of school education. So out of school education, 0.5% is the only increase given to teacher training. Surely the Honourable Minister would agree this is simply not sufficient to ensure that our teachers are well equipped to handle the classroom. Just last year, the Standing Committee had highlighted in its report that an estimated 23% of teacher posts under the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan were lying vacant. The situation is likely to have worsened following the pandemic. But despite the NEP identifying teacher training as a critical component of our education ecosystem, there are few concrete steps to address the various challenges faced by our teachers in this budget. And, the fact is that we do not have enough professors, researchers, scientific scholars in our university system either. So it's not confined to school education alone. If our students are well served, our university teachers are also no less so. We don't make it attractive enough for others to join their ranks. Many qualified teachers are already leaving university jobs to join the remedial institutes set up by private companies, where conditions and rewards are much better. As salaries for our college professors have failed to keep up with other professions, and given the over-bureaucratization of our universities, as recently as September last year, over 6,210 teaching posts across 42 central universities were lying vacant. Center-state coordination only further adds to the challenge. In my own state of Kerala, a large number of assistant professors in the state had written to me highlighting that despite the UGC stipulating advance increments for those of them who are MPhil and PhD holders, the state government has withheld these increments and alleged that our professors are not entitled to them, despite every neighboring state implementing these
Shashi
provisions.
Tharoor ji,
Now, sorry?
Please, there are three more speakers from your party.
Yeah, I was told I had 25 minutes. I've only taken about 10 or 12.
The total time for the Congress party is 25 minutes, and it's almost 20 minutes
Give
now.
me a few minutes more.
There are another three
I'm
speakers.
only about halfway through the points I want to make.
If you want, you can use up the time. The leader is here.
So I just want to stress that the fact that the financial security of these assistant professors has been hijacked because the UGC gives one recommendation, the state government doesn't implement it, suggests that the central government could perhaps issue some clear directives to the states. Now, Mr. Chairman, let me at least quickly come to the key other points before wrapping up. One is that our higher education system, and I'm repeating my view here, the Minister knows it, is over-regulated and under-governed. It's really disquieting to see how our regulatory institutions are restraining academic achievement rather than promoting it. They need to move beyond the regulation of process, size, numbers, to a results-based system where the emphasis is on learning outcomes and not on how many classrooms, what size of classroom, how many teachers, which is what the regulators seem to be doing. In this context, it's disappointing to note that the allocations for the Department of Higher Education have fallen by roughly 1,000 crore to 38,350 crore this year, including significant cuts for schemes like the Higher Education Funding Agency, whose allocations have fallen from 2,000 crores again to 1 crore. There's some magic about this 1 crore that the government likes to reduce everything to. This is a scheme introduced by the late Arun Jaitley in 2016, which was designed to allow our institutes to borrow capital from the market. And in its absence, I must say, I really fear greater governmental control over our institutes. All the more a problem since RUSA, established in my time at the ministry as a device to fund state universities, has been starved of funds for a 6th successive year. Now, I had previously raised the issue of over-centralization during my discussions with the Honourable Minister, and I want to stress that the prominence given to the National Testing Agency, the National Higher Education Regulatory Authority, Board of Governors to run institutions of higher education, the danger that we should watch out for is for the tendency to go against your stated goals of greater flexibility and actually instead create one mode of top-down regulation. That we must be very careful to avoid high levels of interference that would only compromise institutional autonomy. And it should be said that whether it's JNU or Jamia Millia or Aligarh or HCU or so many others, in the last few years, our campuses have no longer remained inclusive spaces that safeguard freedom of expression and individual liberties. Instead, there's been a systematic effort to alter the character of our colleges and universities through the imposition of a singular and dominating ideology. That's not just an assault on the soul of free, diverse, and inclusive India, but I think will deprive our young people of the opportunity to access spaces where the social barriers of class and caste are left behind, where they can lead an empowered life, where narrow-minded identities are replaced by willingness to embrace differences and cherish diversity of thought and belief. This is ultimately the real training ground for our next generation of leaders. Let us pay attention to giving them that freedom. But to ensure that, we have to ensure affordability of university education and accessibility. And that's where some of the overemphasis on private resources for education raise worries, because we need to be able to continue giving very accessible, affordable education in the public sector for universities to be able to embrace the poorest and most marginalized sections of our society. I applaud your desire to have world-class universities, Mr. Minister, and I support you in wanting foreign campuses, eminent foreign universities to set up campuses here, but they should not be at the expense of funding your existing central universities. Their grants have declined by roughly 1,000 crores when compared to the RE of the previous year. Similarly, despite warning signs from the pandemic, the allocations for research and innovation have actually fallen from already paltry levels of just 307 crores in the previous budget estimates to 237 crores in the current financial year. That's a 25% cut, making us the only country to chart such a course of action on research after the events of last year. Let me just say I appreciate the hard work the Minister has put into reforming the education system. These underwhelming allocations actually let him down badly. His own government has let him down because what we're seeing is the NEP, which, by the way, Minister Saab, please ensure we discuss in Parliament at some point the actual policy, which this temple of democracy should not be reduced to a notice board or just a budget counting exercise. But I do want to say that since our higher education has been so process-oriented and outcome deficient, we need to really make an effort to ensure that, that your ministry's requirements are properly funded. You had submitted a requirement of 10.37 lakh crores for the 5-year period 21-26 before the 15th Finance Commission. And that's about 2 lakh crores a year. You've received less than half of that in the current budget. So if you're going to get half of what you believe you need, how will you do your job properly? So I will try and end here. There's a lot more I wanted to say, but Mr. Chairman, you have asked me to cut down. Over-reliance on Anganwadis and school education is rather unwise, and so on. But I will end specifically with one particular point, which is that the Education Ministry needs more resources than are provided for in the demand for grants before us. मंत्री जी, आपने अपना काम तो कर दिया, लेकिन वित्त मंत्रालय ने जितने पैसे आपको दिए हैं, इनसे आपकी ख्वाहिशें सपने ही रहेंगे। जय हिंद जी।
Thank you.